with his wife Carol in Pawleys Island. He is a member of St. Paul's Waccamaw United Methodist Church. Mr. Anderson holds a BS degree from East Tennessee State University and is the owner of Anderson Home Design and Sales Incorporated. Previously, he worked 30+ years in manufacturing engineering, manufacturing management, and program management with the Magnavox Corporation, Sperry Univac Incorporated, and the Raytheon Company. While working in the corporate world, he spent his leisure time coaching and managing youth sports. Mr. Anderson.
And his mother.
Oh, I never met Judy Clark. They're one of the Georgetown Councilman.
Really?
Yeah.
Can everybody hear me out there? Coming through?
Yeah.
I did good for this year.
How's that?
Good.
Oh, that's all right. Okay, I can manage the mic. What I'd like to talk about tonight, my theme is we don't appreciate what we have until we lose it. And before getting into that, let you know a little bit more about me. I was born in Walter Reed Hospital in Washington, D.C. about 2 months after the invasion of our Allied forces at Normandy. That's D-Day. So that takes me back a ways. I think I've got a baseline that's way back, so I've seen a lot of change in this country. And that's really the reason I'm standing up here before you this evening, because I'm worried about our country. A couple of years ago, some folks from my church came to me and said, "We've got a job for you. We want you to run for county council." I've never been interested in politics, and I'm still not interested in politics. But I've been blessed, and I felt it was time for me to give back a little bit. So here I stand. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about history tonight, and that's certainly not an area that I'm comfortable with, having a technical background as I do. But I'm going to start out by talking about a couple of articles that I've received in the last few years. I get a lot of political articles. But these are articles that have really stuck with me. The first one I want to talk about was written by a lady in Eastern Europe, probably Hungary or Poland or one of those countries. And she was talking about us being a shining light on the hill that we are. And went on and talked about how she's worried about what's going on with our international policy and our domestic policy and what's happened to the shining light, or the island of the swamp, as some people might call it. And that's not unusual. We've all heard those stories. But then she wrapped up the article by saying, you know, I don't blame the politicians about what's going on in the United States. I blame the citizens, because they're the folks that elected these people. Right. And it's kind of funny that last week, when our Chief Supreme Court Justice, John Roberts, dropped this ruling about Obamacare, and he put it right back in our laps and said the same thing. I'm not going to make a decision for you folks. You hired these people. If you don't like them, if you don't like these laws, you fire them. Pretty interesting thing that came back full circle in a couple of years. Now, the second article that I want to talk about is a little disturbing, but what I'm trying to do is paint a picture here of history and maybe how we can beat history if we go back to our roots, so bear with me when I go through this. This second article is written by Professor Joseph Olson from Hamlin University School of Law in St. Paul, Minnesota. And it was probably written 3 or 4 years ago. But in that article, he talks about a Scottish history professor at the University of Edinburgh named Alexander Tyler. And this man wrote the words that I'm going to talk about, that I'm going to quote, in 1887. he was talking about the fall of the Athenian Republic 2,000 years ago, and he said this: "A democracy is always temporary in nature. It simply cannot exist as a permanent form of government. Democracy will continue to exist until the time the voters discover that they can vote themselves generous gifts from the public treasury. From that moment on, the majority always votes for the candidates who promise the most benefits from the public treasury, with the result that every democracy will finally collapse over loose fiscal policy, which is always followed by dictatorship." Not something we want to hear. And he goes on to say, "The average age of the world's greatest civilizations from the beginning of history have been about 200 years. Those nations always progress through the following sequence: from bondage to spiritual faith." I want you to think about these as I go through them and where we are in this cycle. From spiritual faith to great courage, from courage to liberty, from liberty to abundance, from abundance to complacency, from complacency to apathy, and from apathy to dependency, and from dependency back to bondage. Think about where we are in that, because Mr. Olson, he feels that we're somewhere between complacency and apathy, with 40% of our population already in the dependency phase. Kind of sobering thoughts. But my thought is, I think we can beat those odds. I think if we go back and understand our roots, take our children, our families, and go look at some of the places and where we came from, maybe we can turn this thing around. We know where our moral fiber is, etc. And let me bring. I'm going to use some of our holidays to bring this into perspective. I'm going to step back to Memorial Day first and tell you a personal story that happened to me back in 1992. Memorial Day is, of course, a day we celebrate all of our fallen heroes, and we've already talked about that tonight. But I had the honor of chaperoning a couple of soccer teams back in '92 to Europe for a round of about, I guess we were out there about a month. And while we were out there, we did a little bit of sightseeing. And one day they took us to an American cemetery in Belgium. Now, to me, Memorial Day, until that point, I hadn't really given a lot of thought. You know, we have picnics, we have families, it's another day of vacation. But that day, it really struck me what this day was. Because there I was in this cemetery, and by the way, that's American soil. Whoever the king was of Belgium was after World War II, he pronounced that land as American soil. So all those folks that were at rest there, all those rows of crosses and Jewish stars were all, although they were across the seas, they were on American soil. So I had these children, they were young men, they were 14 and 15 years old, and it occurred to me that most of them weren't that much younger than those fallen heroes in those graves far away from home. And that day, it made me realize what Memorial Day really was. So I want you to keep that in mind as I continue to weave this story. I'll move on now to Independence Day. Independence Day, July 4th, 1776. But let's push back a year. That's when the fighting really started. The Constitution wasn't signed until about a year after we were already at war with England. And those first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord, if you'll remember from your history. Now, as we go into this thing, the 4th of July, Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence drafted by Thomas Jefferson on that day. And I want to read the first paragraph of that document. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of the nation and nations God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes to which impel them to separation. That's the first paragraph. Now I want to read you the first sentence out of the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, and then take you to a president some years later and what he said about this first sentence in the second paragraph. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, a fellow by the name of Abraham Lincoln came along some decades later, and he made this statement about that sentence in the Declaration of Independence. And he said that future generations read these words, they will realize, and quote, they have a right to claim it as though they were blood of the blood and flesh of the flesh of the men who wrote that declaration, and so they are. Folks, they're talking about us. We're the blood of the blood and the flesh of the flesh of our founding fathers. Please don't forget that, all of you out there. I think that's something you need to take home with you tonight. Now, I'll finish and read the last sentence out of the Declaration because it means something there too. And for the support of this declaration, with firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. When these men signed this document, they set themselves up for treason with a crown. They could have all been hung. They had no life insurance. They had no Social Security to take care of their families. They put everything on the line for us, and we need to remember that. Then finally, in October of 1781, the British surrendered at Georgetown, Virginia, and in 1783, the war finally ends. But what I want you to take away from also that last sentence was we're going to rely on the protection of divine providence. A friend of mine let me borrow a book a couple of years ago. Charlie Harris, some of you may know him out there. He said, you've got to read this book. It's about George Washington and the Revolutionary War. And the thing that impressed me most about reading the letters from George Washington back to the Founding Fathers in the Continental Congress and from some of his officers and enlisted men, they truly believed that God was with them in the fight for this nation. Remember, we were fighting against the British. That was the strongest empire in the world at that time. Not only that, they had hired mercenaries from Germany to come over and do the fighting. Finally, Benjamin Franklin talked the French into coming to help us out in about 1780, and that's where we defeated the Brits at Georgetown, Virginia. So, in having said that, well, I'm going to take another minute because there's something else I want to talk about. Something else that's changed in my lifetime. And I want to talk about the Constitution and the First Amendment and taking Christ out of Christmas. That's something that's bothered me, but I've seen this coming in my lifetime. I never thought I'd see it, but we're there. All this stuff about the separation of church and state. And I'm going to read out of the First Amendment, and that's the first 10 amendments. And I'm sorry, I'm messing this thing up here. What Congress said, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise therefore. That's the only thing in the Declaration of Independence or in the Constitution that says anything about religion. There's nothing in there about separation of church and state. As a matter of fact, we, the people, held church services in the rotunda of